trick or treat at that guy's house this Halloween. So over on the right now, one of the things we don't see much on the river these days is older buildings. This is one of the oldest we see, the Reed Murdoch building from 1912, part of the Prairie School of Architecture. One thing Prairie School architects tended to believe was that the outside of the building ought to reflect what goes on the inside of the building. So these design elements in between the windows here are supposed to be wheat shafts, representing the fact that this was a grocery warehouse. The clock tower was initially right in the middle of the building. It's a little off-center now because they had to lop off part of the building where they added this low bridge. The LaSalle Street Bridge years later. There wasn't always a bridge here at all. It used to be that when you passed the river on LaSalle, you didn't go over the river, you went underneath it. Back in the 1870s, they dug out a tunnel. They kept on using it for streetcars through the 50s. They filled it up with damp sand in 1957, but it's still down there to this day. One of several disused tunnels downtown, like 40 feet below the loop, there's about 60 miles of old freight tunnels that they dug out in the early 20th century to push coal and mail around. 1925, there was a big thing where every cop in the city was put to work trying to find a gangster who had run into the freight tunnels. Apparently, he had gone to the office of Officers Elbridge Coran and shot his desk, then disappeared into the tunnels. After 3 days, they stopped because it turned out that Sergeant Coran had made up the whole thing. He had shot his own desk. The next day, he shot his car and said gangsters did it. Low Bridge. So for this, Sergeant Coran was suspended for 30 days. He eventually got fired years later, but he showed up drunk. Now, over on the right, the Merchandise Mart, 1930, Art Deco by Graham Anderson, Probst, and White. So, this is not quite as flashy as what I normally think of when I think of Art Deco, but you gotta remember, this is built to be a warehouse. Usually when I think of warehouses, I think of like corrugated metal and aluminum siding. So this was built for the Marshall Field Company. They had 13 small warehouses, decided that one big one was better than 13 little ones. So they ended up with this building of about 4 million square feet. That's about the same square footage as the Sears Tower. These things out front that look like giant Pez dispensers are busts of the giants of merchandising. Guys like Marshall Field himself, of course, Montgomery Ward is up there. I always wish you could put a quarter in a slot and make them talk. Like at Marshall Field up there going, I'm Marshall Field. I was a total jerk who got all my good ideas from Harry Selfridge but gave him no credit whatsoever. Ha 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 ha. I don't know why I think Marshall Field laughed like the Count from Sesame Street, but I believe it. Alright, so the Field Company didn't end up owning the building for long. They ran out of money during the Depression, had to sell it along with all the land over here to Joseph Kennedy of the Kennedy family, father of JFK. So they still own a chunk of the land here. The large new blue building is called Wolf Point West. This one under construction is Wolf Point East. They're about to build Wolf Point South right over there. So I love that they're calling these the Wolf Point buildings too. Wolf Point is what the earlier pioneers and settlers used to call this patch of land back in the old days. Exactly why they called it that is kind of lost to history now, but probably just a reference to the fact that there were so many wolves in the environment back then. In fact, every winter in the 1840s, they would have a holiday where they shut down all the businesses and have everybody help chase wolves out of the woods and out into the ice on the lake. It was a holiday not unlike Whacking Day or Weasel Stomping Day, which are still celebrated in a couple of small towns. According to cartoons. So this was downtown Chicago to the early settlers. Downtown in those days meant 5 or 6 log cabins. Most famous was a place called the Saguenash Hotel, which was not exactly a hotel so much as it was a tavern. You could pay to sleep there, but you didn't get a bed. You slept on the floor and you liked it. For an extra fee, you would rent a blanket, but if you were so foolhardy as to fall asleep under that blanket, they would take it right off of you and rent it to somebody else while you slept. Probably not just to be mean either. I mean, it was probably really hard to get clean laundry in the frontiers. Like little things like that we don't think about as much anymore, like how hard it used to be to turn water into ice. We could only do that whenever we felt like it lately. Like my new apartment has a hole in the wall where they used to deliver the ice every day. So cold storage used to be quite a lot trickier. This big building in front of us on the left is from 1907. It's the old North American Cold Storage Mart. Oldest building we see on the river. To keep things cool inside of that, as of 1907, what they had to do was they didn't have any windows at all. The walls were 3 feet thick. You can still see that in some of the cutouts. And the walls were stuffed with frozen horsehair, frozen cork, and pipes full of ammonia and brine that were pumped all through the place as a coolant. So So in the 1970s, architect Harry Weiss decided he wanted to turn it into condos and lofts. So to do that, he had to cart away 500 train car loads of frozen horsehair. Then he had to thaw the building out for 6 months. Then he had to add all of the windows. Then he had to add all these architectural bracings. These stars are not decorations, they're holding the whole building together. Then he had to carve out spaces for all the plumbing and electricity to go through. It would have been a lot easier and probably a lot cheaper just to tear the whole building down and build a new one. But Harry Weiss was a very preservation-minded architect. They used to say never stand next to Harry Weiss for 5 entire minutes. Otherwise, he'll declare you a public landmark and you'll have to get your have a public hearing every time you want to cut your hair. All right, so coming up at the Kinsey Street Bridge, another one to duck over, partly in solemn reverence to remember the brave tourists who were on a ship just like this the day the Dave Matthews Band's tour bus stopped right here so that the driver could let off all of the sewage off of the bus, through the bridge, and onto the boat below. I was not there that day, but we remember. Now everybody clap for the wedding. Enjoy your wedding pictures on the Dave Matthews Band poop bridge. I'm pretty sure that's the one that I'm going to crack my head open on one day, the Dave Matthews Band poop bridge. Then I'll be the ghostly bent neck tour guide of the Dave Matthews Band poop bridge. Just my luck. Alright, so we're getting into a residential area right now. A lot of tour guides are not allowed to talk at all here, but I think that's because the people in the Kinsey Park townhouses here are paying off their bosses. But again, I'm not seeing any of that, so I'm just going to keep on talking. So the townhouses over here are called Kinsey Park. It's basically a gated subdivision from the suburbs, plopped down in the middle of the city. People moved in perhaps not really thinking about the fact that every couple of minutes a boat's going to go by talking into a microphone about how expensive your house is. So the first question people always ask me is, what do those go for? Last I checked, it was about $3.5 million a townhouse. Now, when they were built in the year 2000, nobody was really sure if they were going to sell or not. It was kind of an experiment, because building housing that faced the river was still a pretty new idea as of the year 2000, just like 20 years ago. Like, if you look over on the other side here, the East Bank Club has its back towards the river from the 1970s. Back in the 70s, nobody was living by the river. It was kind of disgusting down around here. You can see little hints of that all over our architecture, different ways that we've interacted with the river over time. Also, little hints about, like, different ways that we've envisioned city living, different ways that we've tried to solve the problems that do come up when you try to cram this many people into such a small space. The square mile behind us has as many people in it as the entire state of Wyoming. You cram that many people together, you know, where do you put them all? Where do you keep their stuff? Where do you park their cars? We have to be pretty creative to make that work around here, but not only do we pull it off, but we pull it off with style. How you doing, man? We all know each other here on the river. I just heard they're about to build a new development here that'll have 270 condo units and 30 parking spaces. I just picture the fights happening now. You know, it's downtown, you don't necessarily need a car, but it's not as common as in New York, where like half the people I know there don't even have a license. Alright, so as we go through the residential district over here, I like playing a game called What Do They Have? This is played by looking out of the boat into the windows of these condos to see what they have. The other day we were playing this and a naked guy walked up to one of the windows, saw what he had. Tips were great that day though. I always find tips are a lot better if we get some hardcore nudity on the tour. Which happens a little more than you'd think. We haven't been moving on the bridges yet today, have we? It happens quite a bit. One thing they didn't tell me when I took this job is how much butt crack I was going to be seeing on the bridges. It's a lot of butt crack. Alright, so ahead of us you can see this statue up on top of a tower. It's a statue called the Beacon of Progress, an old symbol of the Montgomery Ward Company. The tower there is probably blocking a water tower like the smaller one over here. Now, you see water towers like that in different cities for different reasons. Like, I work in New York a couple of months out of the year. New York water towers like that are built because the way the plumbing was designed there, if you have a building higher than 5 stories, you need your own water tower or you won't get any water pressure. Here, they were built for fire prevention. So I don't know if you guys heard, but in 1871, we had a pretty big fire. Wiped out most of the city. We call it the Great Chicago Fire. So after that, we had a lot of arguments about how we could prevent that from happening again. Like, if you dig through 1870s newspapers, you can find transcripts of arguments about whether wood is more flammable than bricks. which of course is more flammable than bricks, come on. So, but during the fire, people were watching bricks explode because the wood around it was going so hot. So, one of the things they came up with was that all the big buildings had to have a water tower like that. Places like the Reed Murdoch building that had some money could build a clock tower to cover it up. Others just kind of had to leave it standing out there. Now, they're always made out of wood. That's kind of interesting. So, you normally would think a water tower would be made of metal. Wood insulates the water better. A metal one might freeze over in the wintertime. A frozen water tower does you no good whatsoever. Now, there's only about 100 of them left today. They're kind of an endangered species in Chicago, but they're still around. Now, coming up next, the next bridge is Chicago Avenue. A couple blocks over from that is Halsted Street. I just recently found an article from like 1904 that said Chicago and Halsted was the single dirtiest intersection in the United States. I don't think the Parks Department really had data about that, but it was that there were so many factories around that they said that if you crossed the street in a wedding dress, by the time you got across the street, you would look like you were going to a funeral instead. There were a lot of factories, a lot of things like catalog warehouses was a big thing. We were the home of the Sears catalog and the Montgomery Ward catalog. I'm old enough to remember the Sears catalog. So, at the time you wouldn't think those would be such big polluters, but they packed all of their shipments with sawdust. That sawdust would blow into the water, made the water a lot thicker, made it harder for other things to sink. So a lot of the glue from the factories would just sit up on the top of it. But thank goodness they have actually fixed up the Chicago Avenue Bridge this year. Used to have these nasty spikes hanging down off of the bottom of it that looked like they were going to give me gangrene every second. So over here on the right, this is now the Groupon building. Here on this tour, you probably know what Groupon's all about. I don't follow the business end, but I think that's the main place they sell tickets. So this is the old Montgomery Ward warehouse where they used to have all of the packaging and stuff. The pickers would go around putting orders together on roller skates to speed things up. And you hear all these horror stories about the Amazon warehouse. Sometimes I wonder why they don't have those guys on roller skates. But I think if I say that out loud, if you listen really carefully, you can actually hear the sound of personal injury lawyers starting to drool. All right, directly in front of us is the old island called Goose Island. I'm going to duck down for just a second. They like me to duck down and get off mic for a second while we turn, so I'll be back in just a second. Those of you holding small children, please stay as far from the edge as you can.
Is this the main location for the Chicago Tribune now?
It's just a warehouse now. This is the Chicago Tribune warehouse, soon to be closed down so they can build a big, fancy residential and retail space here. You can see, if you look underneath the Chicago Tribune sign, you can see a rendering of what they're going to make it look like eventually. They've been talking about that for years and years now. I'll kind of be surprised if it actually happens at this point. But Goose Island back behind us was originally known as Kilgovan. Kilgovan was apparently the region in Ireland where the early settlers came from, but nobody could ever figure out where exactly in Ireland Kilgovan was. Not for lack of looking. Cub reporters on slow news days would often be assigned to try to find the original Kilgovan on a map. None of them ever quite managed it. It's now known as Goose Island, probably best known as the home of the Goose Island Brewery. A couple of years ago, they put out a beer called the Illinois. And the Illinois had a label with a big drawing of a skyscraper on it that was a rendering of Frank Lloyd Wright's Illinois building, which he never built but would have built right around here. It was a design he came up with for a 5,000-foot tall skyscraper in the 1950s. Now and then, architects will come up with a design like that, like a mile-high building, or a couple of years ago, there was a design going around for a skyscraper that would be dangled from an asteroid that orbited the Earth, and twice a day you could parachute into Midtown Manhattan. I don't think anybody ever actually thought that was going to be built. Usually these are just like intellectual exercises that serve as good publicity stunts for the architects. But Frank Lloyd Wright was really serious about the Illinois building. He had meetings, he met with investors, he built scale models of the thing. He was quite certain that his design for a 5,000-foot tall building was actually going to work. Now, architects who go over the plans now are kind of divided as to whether it would actually have worked. Some say it might have, but even they say he would have needed a lot more elevators and an awful lot more bathrooms in there. Any questions at this point? even if it's something totally off the wall. I know I've been fairly thorough.
Was that like a legend about the guy with the Garbage Island?
The Garbage Island guy? It's more or less real. It's it's the way he likes to tell the story. It's a little more complicated than that, but yeah, he was a real guy who really at least took credit for all of that landfill and held off the cops for 30 years. George Wellington Streeter, his name was. I've never been able to quite piece together fact from fiction in the story. It's going to be a really long thread for somebody to go through sometime. I've had a lot of interviews with Captain Streeter. He talked exactly like Popeye. But thinking through historical stuff is something I like to do. Like over here, this is called Montgomery Ward Park, named after Montgomery Ward, whose big thing in Chicago, besides the department store, was pushing through Daniel Burnham's vision of keeping the lakefront free. That was part of Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago, keeping the lakefront forever free. Now, Burnham's most famous quote, the one they paint on the walls of the Sears Tower and the Hancock building and every other tourist trap in the city, was make no little plans. They have no magic in them to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans, aim high in hope and in work. Now, for years, there was an asterisk next to that quote, because it sounded like it was a really good quote, sounded like the kind of thing he would have said, but nobody could ever quite establish that he actually did. In fact, Daniel Burnham Jr., who built the Carbide and Carbon building, wrote a whole letter saying, I don't think my dad ever really said that thing. However, a couple of months ago, I was asked to do the new Who's Who book for Graceland Cemetery, where all the architects are buried, including some who weren't even dead yet. They've already got their plots there. I found all of their files. But Burnham happens to be buried there, so I was doing some research on him in the microfilm room at the library. Happened to find the transcript of the speech he made in 1910. There was the quote, word for word. So it turns out he really did say it after all. I got my name in the paper for that one. It's kind of my claim to fame in Chicago architecture now. But I love it when I actually get to solve a mystery like it. Going underneath Ohio Street now. Ohio Street was the site of one of my favorite places in Chicago history, the Wind Blew Inn with two N's. It was a bohemian coffee shop in the 1920s run by a teenage flapper named Lillian Colley. Cops used to raid the place all the time because of rumors she was hosting petting parties there. She had to go in front of a judge and say, Your Honor, I swear there is no snuggle pupping at the Wind Blew Inn. Judge sentenced her to read a book of fairy tales to cure her of her feminist ideals. Worked about as well as you'd think. Took me forever to figure out whatever happened to her. It turned out that she changed her name and became a mystery novelist a few years later. But I was able to track her son down. He's still around. Alright, so right ahead of us you can see this bridge just standing upright. Now most of these bridges are drawbridges. Well, officially what they are is called bascule bridges. They open in the middle. I can't really, it's hard to do with the microphone. But this one is the old Kinsey Street Railroad Bridge. When they first built it, it was the largest steel drawbridge in the world. It went up and down about 30 times a day to make room for ships coming through and then go back down for the trains to come over. But by the 1990s, only one train was still using it, just one going to what is now the Holiday Inn, which was at the time the Sun-Times building. After that one stopped using it, no train was using that stretch of tracks at all anymore. So they just keep it up all the time now. About once a year, they lower it down just to make sure they still can. But it's never on a day when I'm actually out on the river myself. It's got landmark status and it's so well built it would probably cost too much money to take the thing down. So it'll just stay up there for the foreseeable future. But helps me illustrate the fact that all of these are in fact drawbridges. Alright, so a few minutes back I talked about Harry Weiss, the very preservation-minded architect. One more low bridge here. Oh, two more to go. He wasn't just a preservation guy, Harry Weiss. He was also a very innovative and rather eccentric architect in his own right. He designed these four cool townhouses coming up on the right once we get past the bridge, the River Cottages, which opened in 1990. They were very postmodern. They were designed to look like the sailboats and schooners that used to sail up to Wolf Point back in the old days. So, at the time when they opened, they sold for, I think, about $500,000 each. Only one of them has ever been back on the market again. A few years ago, one sold for 2.2. And I love the fact that it happened, really, because of that, we finally got a real estate listing with pictures of the inside. And based on the pictures of the inside, which I had always wondered about, I got the distinct impression that in 1990, Harry Weiss and his staff must have been watching a lot of Pee-wee's Playhouse. But were we all? Over here, the carving building River Bend, when this place was built, these guys had the best view of downtown in the city. Now they have the best view of Wolf Point West. A couple tried to sue over that, though it didn't go too far. Mansionettes down below, condos up top. Middle section is a parking garage. But it's so narrow you can't really turn cars around it. There's an elevator that brings the cars up to the different levels. Now, car elevators are something we've been experimenting with in Chicago since the 1920s. Because as I was just saying, we've got a really small space that we're trying to cram a real lot of stuff into. We have to be kind of creative to make that all right. You can see these fans going off. What those are doing is pumping out diesel exhaust fumes from the trains that are hidden back behind that wall. A lot of these buildings are built on what is called air rights. A lot of the back in the 20s, the railroads figured out that they could sell the rights to the air up above their tracks for people to build buildings onto. They just had to leave room for the trains down below and somehow still have the building be structurally sound. Which wasn't the easiest thing in the world, but they pulled it off over and over again. And speaking of uneasy feats of engineering, right in front of us is one of our newest architectural landmarks, 150 North Riverside by Getch Partners. This one that looks like it's got a wedge chopped out of it. That stone portion in the middle represents all of the room that they actually had for building. Every building has to be X number of feet back from the river. After that, they had train tracks to deal with, so that just sat empty for decades while architects tried to figure out what could be done that was cost effective. Bridge after Washington Boulevard. So, eventually Getch Partners figured out they could build what is called a core-supported structure, rise up as far as they need you to be out of the way, then flare outward, create their own space up in the sky. This one is especially vulnerable to high winds, so to lessen the effect, they've got a thing called a liquid-tuned mast damper. And what that is a giant tank of water that's designed so that when the wind blows one way, the water will flow the other way to keep everything steady. Remarkable feat of engineering, but it's so simple when you think about it, it's like something the ancient Romans might have done. If the ancient Romans could build 750-foot tall skyscrapers, which they could not. Not having access to William LeBaron Jenny or steel frame construction. So there. Gonna dip back a little bit into postmodernism of the 1980s with Perkins and Will's Boeing building right over here, originally the Morton Salt building. Now this is another air rights building. If you look through the bushes, you can see the grates. If you look through the grates, sometimes you can see the lights of the trains going by there. The trick with this one, though, is you see that the bridge is loud. You can see there's a taller portion and a smaller portion here in the Boeing building. The smaller portion is built over the part of the tracks where the tracks cross over each other. That means they didn't have as much room for support beams and columns to hold the building up as they would normally have. So instead, there are steel trusses up on the roof that attach it to the larger portion. That smaller portion is effectively being dangled off of the larger portion. Turned a lot of heads when they built it. Some people weren't sure it was going to work, but it's still there. And now we'll jump back to the 1920s a little bit, the Art Deco era with the Chicago Daily News building by Hullabird and Roots. Now this was one of the first large skyscrapers to have a public veranda out in the front here, which was kind of an odd idea at the time. Not only was nobody else doing public verandas, but also Madison Street was called Skid Row in those days. There's a terrific novel from the 40s called Knock on Any Door by Willard Motley. It's the origin of the phrase, live fast, die young, and have a good-looking corpse. Every other page of that book is somebody is getting mugged in the veranda of the Chicago Daily News building. Now, the Daily News stopped being published in the 70s, only a few years of it are even digitized, but the third floor microfilm room at the Harold Washington Library has a whole run of the Daily News, as well as the Chicago Times, the Chicago Herald, the Chicago American, the Chicago Examiner, the Chicago Post, the Chicago Press, the Chicago Journal, Chicago Record, the Chicago Mail, the Chicago Globe, the Chicago Democrat, the Chicago Democratic Press, the Chicago Gem of the Prairie, the Chicago Dispatch. They only have on hard copy and paper, and they won't let anybody see it because it's falling apart, and it drives me nuts. I spend more time in the microfilm room than I should probably honestly admit to. Well, speaking of, coming up on the left here, I've already talked about how sometimes the outside of the building reflects the inside. You can see this stone one, the white stone one here on the left, the old Hartford Insurance building from the 60s. Here, the strength of the exterior stone is protecting the fragility of the interior glass, the same way the strength of a Hartford Insurance policy protects your fragile life. Maybe, I don't know. I couldn't find a lot of good data about the Hartford Insurance building. Now, one thing I did find out, though, is Hartford Insurance is one of about half a dozen insurance companies in the city that in the 1890s got caught up in the swindles of H.H. Holmes, the devil in the white city guy. We tend to advertise him now as America's first known serial killer, which is not remotely accurate. I started doing tours on him 10 years ago, got so deep into the research, I ended up doing a 600-page book on the guy. It's called H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil. It's got me in all these documentaries in Rolling Stone, New York Times. Holmes was a swindler first and foremost. When he added a third story onto his building, he went to Hartford and 5 other insurance companies to buy an insurance policy for it. Strangely enough, 6 weeks later, it caught fire. None of the insurance companies were fooled.